Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Marisa Caitiolo. I'm the president of a board of directors of an international nonprofit organization called Building Bridges Foundation. And our organization basically is dedicated to cultivate an understanding between cultures through international exchanges, traveling exhibitions, residencies for artists. And basically, Kim Martindale asked me this year to try to bring aboard to the fair a little bit of the Latin American artists and some presence here. So we have the honor today to have a wonderful guest here with us, Andrés Navia and Dermis de Leon. Dermis de Leon is a curator and art writer from Cuba, based in Berlin. Basically, her practices and research explore Latin American artists concerning about aesthetic, fragility, issues of identity, cultural crossing, mobility, and mobility in urban spaces. So we have Dermis here, who is going to talk today about the contemporary scene and presenting a very interesting artist now, Latin American artist now in the United States. And we have Andrés Navia, a head of AMA, the Museum of the Americas, in Washington, D.C. Before joining AMA, he worked for 7 years at the International Development Bank in cultural projects in the Maya region and in the youth violence prevention programs in Central America. Mr. Navia graduated in Georgetown University School of Foreign Services, Washington, D.C., where he obtained the degree in political science. So it's an honor to have both of them with us today. Mr. Navia will talk about the collection and the permanent collection of the museum, and we'll welcome him. So thank you for being here today.
Okay, thank you very much, Marisa. Marisa Caitiolo has been incredible in organizing and having us here. We really appreciate you building this bridge and having us here. And I'm sure this is the beginning of a long-term working relationship. So thank you very much. And thank you to the LA Art Show for having us here. Before beginning, I'm gonna start reading a quote that somehow set the guidelines and the trend of the Art Museum of the Americas. And it reads as follows: modern art, especially the abstract school, is the strongest bastion of democracy in our times. In totalitarian regimes, art is directed. It's superficial, full of cliches, and claims to spread totalitarian ideals without ever quite succeeding. José Gómez Sicre, 1964. José Gómez Sicre was the founder of the Art Museum of the Americas, and he was actually the key player, and he reflected the organization that I'm going to explain later on. But in essence, the collection that you see, part of it, of course, displayed in this slideshow is strongly related to this quote I just read. I'll let you know a little bit about the Organization of American States. The Art Museum of the Americas is an integral part of this organization. It used to be called the Pan American Union, and it became the Organization of American States in 1948 in the midst of the Cold War era. It unified most of the Latin American countries and the Spanish-speaking Caribbean. And they joined forces with the United States with the overall scheme of development and trade and integration, but with the underground common purpose of preventing the spread of communism. Today, the OAS is a completely different institution. The current Secretary General, who's from Chile, he's of a socialist background, and the organization somehow has broken its strong ties to the fight, obviously because of the end of the Cold War and other matters. And it focuses today on peace, democracy, human rights, justice, and social and economic transformation. So I'm going to start. This presentation is full of questions, many unsolved matters. I will start with the question about Latin America. Where did this term come from, and how it is related to our presence right here today. And you want the Latin America as a unified region with unified culture and well, Portuguese and Spanish-speaking countries. But there, of course, there is a tremendous amount of differences. But in general terms, Latin America is the most homogeneous subcontinent, despite this differences. And it somehow works that the whole region is identified with this name, even though this term originated in France in the 1850s by a group of intellectual Frenchmen associated to the imperial regime, and this was coined somehow to counter the United States expansion in the midst of France's imperial pretensions. Why are we talking about Latin America here today? Why Marisa brought this to the LA Art Show? And I believe this is strongly related to economic factors, like the rise of Brazil and Mexico as leading economic players today. As most of you must know, Mexico City is the second or third hub of contemporary art after New York City and LA. Some people say that Mexico City is now more important than LA in the contemporary art scene. And of course, there's a boom in contemporary art consumption and contemporary art museums, part of which Latin American art has been playing an important role. And next, the prominence of the Latino community in the United States that has strongly been related to this growing interest in Latin America and Latino art. And Dermis will go through this much more thoroughly.
It's very important that you mention all these issues because I don't have to explain later. So I could concentrate in the artists that I'm presenting. Thank you.
Great.
Yeah.
So it's important to mention that the Art Museum of the Americas was the first museum in the world concentrating in modern Latin American art. And it's related to the birth of the Organization of American States in 1948. So this immediately ties our permanent collection to the Cold War and the vision of its first director and founder, José Gómez Sicre, who was Cuban-born, and who emigrated to the United States and became a staunch opponent of the Castro regime. José Gómez Sicre started the museum with an art exhibition program, and the basic nature of his exhibit program is associated to his sympathy to international trends in contemporary art, his eagerness to demonstrate cosmopolitanism of Latin American artists. He favored universal aesthetics with transformed elements of heritage, and he was a staunch opposer of tropicalism and folklorism, and of course, he was a strong opponent of the Mexican muralism and any sort of art affiliated to propagandistic affiliations to communism. Also, the collection is strongly associated to a very evident government-private sector affiliation in the U.S. Latin American affairs. The U.S. and Latin American elites, as collectors and sponsors of cultural exchange, assumed a leading role in promoting Latin American art in the United States and in the configuration of our museum. These elites viewed themselves as stakeholders in inter-American relations, and they viewed they had this mission, and there was no government pressure for them to do this. There was just a natural connection, and symbolic of this private government link is the role of Nelson Rockefeller and his donation to valuable pieces to our collection, especially one of our most important pieces by Uruguayan Torres Garcia. Also, Nelson Rockefeller supported the Esso salons. Some of you may remember Esso was the name of ExxonMobil. And this was in the midst of very important oil projects in Latin America. So the Art Museum of the Americas organized this art salons all over Latin America quite successfully. And also IBM played a key role in donating important pieces. IBM in the 50s and 60s was expanding quite strongly in Latin America. Now I'll talk quite briefly about the permanent collection. As you may see from these images, the core of the collection focuses on abstract expressionism. We also have a strong section of the collection focusing on geometric abstraction, optical art, and kinetic art. And the museum and its origins and its collection were also strongly linked to the Sao Paulo and Venice biennials. And the museum played an important role in becoming a bridge between the artists and these biennials. Some of the most representative artists, as you may have seen here in the slideshow, I'll go briefly over some names that may ring a bell to you, are Petoruti and Poliseyo from Argentina, Portinari, Di Prete, Otake, Toyota, and Mabe from Brazil. We have a very strong link with the Japanese-Brazilian artists in our collection. Mata from Chile, Obregón from Colombia, Portocarrero, Carreño, and Amelia Peláez from Cuba. These are really important Cuban masters from obviously the pre-revolution era. Mérida from Guatemala, though he lived in Mexico. De Cislo from Peru. Figari and Torres Garcia from Uruguay. And Cruz Diaz, Soto, and Poleo from Venezuela. So this is more or less a summary of the core origin and the core collection of the Art Museum of the Americas. But I'm going to briefly overview what's happening today with the museum. The end of the Cold War has affected the museum in terms of funding and political support for the last 20 years or so. Nevertheless, we're making a strong effort to regain institutional legitimacy by aligning our current programming with the OAS agenda, doing a lot of exhibits associated to human rights, women's rights, freedom of expression. I must admit that the bias of only dealing with Latin American artists that are associated to the cosmopolitan and the urban is still present. I myself have a bias, and it's inevitable. It happens to all of us. I try to avoid any connection to tropicalism and folklorism. And I don't know if we're missing an important part of our culture and our nature by having this bias, but that is what is happening. The mission of the museum has been transformed into making art as an element and as an instrument of social change. So we support politically and socially engaged art as opposed to the origins of the museum. I want to mention a recent experience with Puerto Rican artist Miguel Luciano, who had a performance as part of our programming in the Washington Monument, where children with difficulties in their migratory status flew kites in the National Mall around the monument, and this got tremendous. We came on the first page of the Washington Post, and this somehow reflected the essence of our new agenda. In this case, through the arts, we were supporting the rights of migrants and the Freedom Act. Of course, within this ideal of connecting and supporting artists with strong political and social agendas, there's always the issue of aesthetic quality and craftsmanship. There, as you may know, is a lot of bad art that covers itself in this social and political matter. So it's always a struggle to balance things with a good message but good quality work using global techniques and craft. We are also opening our doors to Latino art. Also, our museum had a strong bias against Latino art in its origins and until quite recently, I must say. It was snubbed. It was viewed as tacky and unsophisticated. And of course, as many of you know, that's completely untrue. And also, Dermis will cover this interesting transformation and this incredibly important trend in trends and richness in Latino art today. So we're opening our doors to that. We're trying to include that in our programming. And of course, the United States is a key member of the Organization of American States, and the ambassadors to the Organization of the American States are the equivalent of our board. And Latino art is technically speaking made in the United States. So we're actually using this as an instrument to gain political support from the U.S., which has been very tough in terms of funding the museum, as the U.S. mission views the museum as non-strategic to the agenda anymore. So we're trying to fight this battle and use Latino art as one of the elements weapons. Yes.
Yeah.
And finally, sustainability for the future of the museum is where we're focusing a lot of energy. We have a wonderful collection, a wonderful location, 2 blocks away from the White House, practically on Constitution Avenue near the National Mall. And so we want to spread the news about the museum looking for an institutional or corporate partner that somehow takes over the management and funding of the operation of the museum. Thank you very much. Yes.
Yeah.
When you talk about Latin American art, and the museum does not agree with folklore, with the ethnical, what I agree personally also. Because I was involved so many years with artists from Latin America. The word, oh, thank you. The word Latin American art includes ethnical and folklore. You cannot take it away. I think a better term, sorry about my comment, is to talk about Latin American artists and not Latin American art, because the Latin American art is that, is the typical, the murals, like you said, Diego Rivera and all that, that includes Latin American art. But if we talk about artists from Latin America, and they themselves very often don't want to be included as Latin American art, they are international, because as we see here, there is nothing there. If you don't know where they are from, you don't, not necessarily they are Latin American artists. They are international artists.
Yes.
Yes, so true.
That's
Yes.
the comment I wanted to make.
I agree. Well, I don't know if any of you have any questions regarding the explanation about the museum, the collection of the museum, the images that you see. Basically, the idea of this project to have these dialogues is to bring a little bit of the history of the work, the collection of the Latin American Museum in Washington, and at the same time, we're going to have Dermis de Leon speaking a little bit about the Latin American artists today and what they're doing today. What is the new trendy thing, what they're doing, what they're working on. So I don't know if you have any questions regarding.
I just wanted to respond to your question, which actually generated your concern. Has been an ongoing issue in the museum, even in the name of the museum. The museum was previously called Museum of Modern Art of Latin America. And there was some questioning and so forth, but I totally agree. I've read a lot about this question. Some people say that we shouldn't talk about Latin American art, but art from Latin America. Even that change in order just changes the understanding and the meaning. So thank you very much for bringing that up. Oh, no, exactly. So there's a difference. Mm-hmm. So, and the idea is to make that difference clear, and at least from my point of view. And this Latino art is the one that may actually save our museum. And there's a strong initiative in Washington, D.C. It was approved, a big study, a $2 million study was approved by Congress like 4 or 5 years ago, for the feasibility of the Museum of the American Latino as part of the National Mall.
So when basically talking about the impact and evolution of Latin American art, now we're going to jump to see the evolution between the collection, the permanent collection of the museum, and what Dermis has to tell us, which is basically a little bit of research and study between the very new emerging artists in New York, Latin American artists in New York at this moment. So this is the idea, to try to bring something fresh to the fair, fresh to LA, into the Latin American movement.
Yeah, thank you very much, Marisa, for inviting me to be here today. Thank you so much for the public here for the art fair. I should say, based on the commentary and the questions raised before, that my talk mostly is going to be focused on artists in New York, because I has been researching, I has been connected to the New York art scene. I know there is a huge and really great art community here in the East, but that's not, I mean, I know artists, but it's no, I no focus on that in this talk. So I call DJ Techno Pop Pulp Future Fictions, and I bring in today 3 points about what I has been looking on the art scene today with few artists, young artists that most of them has been working in New York from Latin America, and artists who were born in New York, and they call themselves Latinos. So it's kind of tricky, I know, it's really controversial, these issues, but it's something that I will try to briefly bring here. So I'm going to read like 3 points that I want to address on the presentation, and then I will show some artists working today. What Elvis Fuentes, a Cuban curator and writer, said in his outstanding essay, Crossroads, Crossing and the Cross, including the impressive catalog of publishing for the recent exhibition celebrating Caribbean culture in New York, Caribbean Art and the Crossroads of the World, that was recently. I would like to apply for the context in which the Latino and Latin American artists presenting here create their works. They live and work in a huge urban polis where multiple suburban cultures are mixing and producing a complete new pop future fictions. Fuentes writes about the Caribbean and his relationship with North America. A tremendous diversity of culture, linguistic, and economic heritage coexists, dialogue and clash in the Caribbean. The intensity of these encounters and the fact that they occur in a limbo territory is similar to the experience of the nomadic brotherhood of the boat coming into contact with the homogenizing and stabilizing forces of the port. The limbo here is a city that is not only a background, but also a main protagonist, a theater of a strange dystopia collapsing in a confusion of multiple layers. I talk about New York, basically. Artists today in New York are raising a context where the sense of community and neighborhoods is still existing, what is called barrios. I point out about this because artists in Florida, in several cities, because of they're living in suburbias, and I think it's another dynamics different from New York. This is my point of view. In New York, there is not only the presence of Latino community, mostly composed before by Boricuas and Dominicans, and also by other Latin American countries, but also people from Asia and Middle East, and also Africa. Children today are born from parents with different backgrounds, nationality, and race. They have been assimilated to the dynamics of economic and cultural models of the dominant culture, which I'm talking about North American culture, while at the same time they incorporate part of their parents' own culture and also the neighborhood where they grew up. So I'm talking about here that we cannot talk anymore about artists basically from parents, both Latino or from Latin America. Some of the artists, the mother or the father are Latino or Latin American, and it's totally a mix, you know? The creation of those, this is one point in the artists I'm presenting here. The creation of those urban subcultures are a mix of pop culture from the mass media, influenced by reality shows, rap music, DJ culture, barrio language, etc. I would like to make a break between the generation 10 years ago and new artists working today. The notion of Latino or Latin American, I know it's very complicated, but it's the way that artists with a Spanish background are perceived by the mainstream. However, those notions help to positioning artists into the institutional sphere, while at the same time it's used by institutions to identify a group beyond nationalities, but with similar Spanish backgrounds, which is mostly the truth. There is a new generation born here from Latino parents, at least one of them. On the other hand, others who were born in Latin America from parents from Europe and North America, but they are called themselves Latin Americans or Latinos. Mostly, actually, what I visited before I came here, the Biennial in Museo del Barrio. 90% of the artists presented there, they were born in the United States. a few of them from Latin America, 3 or 4, and the other from Filipinas. So I think it's very interesting how the Museo del Barrio, a museum that was created by the Puerto Rican community, has been changing their focus from the Puerto Rico community to open to Caribbean and beyond Latin American artists and Latino. So I know it's very tricky, but a lot of institutions are talking about Latino culture, and they include themselves Latin American artists. And it's I think it's kind of political and very comfortable thing to talk about Latino in general. And the artists that from Latin America, they come to New York, they basically they function in this frame, no? That's one point. And the other, so for me, the break this is one bit different. We have this generation that came from Latin America, or they grew up basically in the United States, or Latin American artists coming in New York. But now we have these new artists. They were, mostly of them, born here, but they were raised in this culture, in this very mixed culture, mixing culture. And second, I would like to start with this. Coco Fusco is an artist, very, very well-known artist already. She worked before with Guillermo Gomez Peña, in several performances. He's a main artist here. And this is very interesting for me. This is a very recent performance that she made in New York. And the performance called Observation of Predation in Humans, a lecture by Dr. Thira, an animal psychologist. So what is interesting for me is how Coco Fusco brings back kind of reference from the 70s, this movie from 1968, which became really a very important reference of discussion about races here in the United States, and how she brings back and she positions herself as Dr. Thira, questioning human behavior today and all this social and political and violence today in the human in humans. But for me, it's interesting because Coco Fusco, Nicolás Dumí Esteves, and other artists from this generation, they, for me, they has been using the discourse of representation, the mainstream discourse of representation to discuss all these issues about identity, about race, about gender, etc. But for me, the big break today is the artists working today. They are breaking totally that way of representing all those issues. They don't use this structure or this form of representation. So Nicolás Dumí Esteves, he was born in Dominican Republic. He has been living in New York 20 years. And as you see, this is another performance that he made. Super Merengue is in 2000. He plays the hero, but as a Super Merengue, with a banana. So all this form of representation is still using the same way of presenting performance in all this tradition of performing artists from the 70s and 80s, basically, bringing into these forms of interaction with the public. He presented this performance, invited the public to dance with him, merengue and salsa, all these rhythms. But still, for me, there's a break in this performance, but still performance presenting in galleries and museums settings. This is another performance that he made in a gallery, you know, typical fried plantains, no, and presenting this stereotype about Latino culture through food with representation of this Latino cooking for the public in the museum. This is another project that he made with Maria, and this is just a big change in his work. He opened a passerby museum and asked the community to bring all the things that they, belongings that he wants, people have in their house, and they preserve that doesn't have any value. It doesn't have any museum values, but it has value for people. And here is where Nicolas Dumay-Esteve breaks that kind of work that he has been doing before in this kind of performance that I showed before. And then he was into working in the community more and more. It was an open museum that people could go there and bring their belongings to show in this kind of museum. And the last performance that he made, he has been working and living in the Bronx for 20 years already. So he created this performance to be reborn, basically, as a Bronx artist. No? So for me, this is very interesting because he's Lebanese, born in Dominican Republic, but now he became an artist from the Bronx. So, and this is a breaking point for me, no? So we are Latinos, but we already are working here in this context and very much embrace the culture creating in the context of suburban culture in New York. This is another performance that he made in Brazil. He was dancing for hours and hours and exhausting the body in this dance to trying to communicate with the public. So Elia Alba, I would try to go faster and because there are a lot of artists. I want to present, and that's why I show short bio. So I'm going from now. I'm going to show artists, one artist after the other, and Elia Alba has been working since the late 90s, but I bring her here because of her last project, which is Elia was born in New York, but her parents are from Dominican Republic. And now, this is for me a big change that I found. This is her last project. She's creating a book that is called The Super Club. And she wants to work with artists, color artists, artists from Latin, but also from mostly working in New York, but from very different backgrounds. And she wants to positioning artists like celebrities. And for me, this is a big change because it's this idea of artists presenting themselves as celebrities. And she said, well, I want to position themselves like models from like we see in Vanity Fair magazine. So this is a whole ongoing project. She's making a book, but at the same time, she's making talk and dinners with the artists, discussing their work, and representing the artist as a specific character, but as a character that position themselves at the same time as a celebrity, no? And this is something that I want to point out about. This is another work of Elia Alba. Because I was telling that the artist, I think today, has been influenced by this urban culture and this mixing between not only Latino popular culture, but also all this mixing in from other cultures, from Black culture, from all this rap culture, DJ, and also mixing also low and high technology, comics reference, and so all this mixing are bringing a kind of vision about the future, kind of dystopia in society, which is I found connections in several discourse and several artists working around these ideas. Elia worked with photography, and she makes these dolls. A mixing of race. The face is a mixing of white and Black people or Latino people with Asian people. So it's this kind of mixing race that is how it's becoming the culture and the background from many people today in the cities. So. I mean, if you have any question, las hermanas Iglesias, Las Hermanas Iglesias, they are Lisa and Janelle Iglesias. They work in separate, but at the same time they make collaborative projects. And again, I found this connection with Elia Alba's work. They're presenting themselves as kind of dolls, these kind of beings, very strange, that they are no females, they are no male. There's like a kind of post-dystopia landscape, like a future where the race are not defined, the sex are not defined. And it's interesting that they also using this similar background as Elia's dolls, no? Karina Aguilera, she is an Ecuadorian artist living in New York. Yeah, so the project that interests me here, that bringing here, interests me a lot is how she tried to connect these two realities from Latin America and also from how here in the United States are. I mean, I think I'm going to show the slide because it's a lot of artists, and I want to show you.
Probably.
Yes, it's much better, yeah, because otherwise, if I explain, I just I just show the artists, and also there are some texts in there that you can see. Otherwise, I think I will go forever in this.
Yes, basically, there. I want to say that if somebody have a question about one of the artists, or they're interested in know a little bit more about some of the artists, these are the new artists, the upcoming emerging artists that are working right now from different countries, from Latin America in New York, living in New York.
So for me, what is interesting, how they bring together both background, both realities. And this series, for instance, she shoot those photographs in the United States and also in Central America, and you cannot distinguish from Central America or from the United States. So you cannot tell. Irving Morazan, he's from Salvador, but he has been for many years living in New York, and for me it's very interesting how he brings together all this background from culture, culture from Central America, mythologies from there, and all this culture, the lowrider, and all this urban culture, and creating this being. Irving Morazan. Lina Puerta. Oh, I chose too fast.
Yeah, I think it's better if you show the images and they can see the names. And
Yeah, I'm going too fast now.
no, it's fine.
It's okay. I think it's more interesting to show all. Tamara, she's another interesting artist. She was born in Israel, but she came to Argentina with 2 years old. So she's an Argentina for me. And then she's working in New York for a long time already. So you can see already this mix together, no? Because they meet all this culture, Argentinian culture, and she makes all these embroiders and with her clothes. Quintin Rivera Toro, he's from Puerto Rico, based in New York also. Jíbaro. Yeah. Excuse me? No, this is an artist living and working in New York. It's not from a museum.
The museum is
Yeah.
in Washington.
In Washington.
The museum is yes,
Yeah.
in Washington. We have a MOLA, the Museum of Latin American Art in Long Beach, which is dedicated to actually Latin American artists as well, which has a different collections. I think basically the main idea of the talk was to show a little bit of a collection and kind of from a museum, and the new artists working right now, the emerging artists coming up inside United States.
Yeah.
So somehow how the Latinos mixing with of course, with the rest of the artists. And as you can see, the work is exactly like the woman was saying. It's an international artist. They're international artists with the same...
I cannot say that. I mean, there is a quality there that's a lot of Latino reference there.
Well,
I cannot, totally. I mean, you can see that we cannot talk about like they are international per se.
Oh, no.
There are a lot of reference, many references, they're still connected.
Well,
both.
with the history, with the...
Yeah. So I want to show the video now. This is a performance. A performance that was how has been changing from all this way of performance from Nicolás Dumí Esteves and Coco Fusco and what the artists are doing today. No, can we show it's a minute of a video where this artist is mixing singers, music, video. All at the same time together, no? This performance was in Museo del Barrio last year in December. So for me, it's a It's so clear, no? Now Samante, she's from the West Coast, from San Francisco. I mean, I guess artists know her work here. She has been working in San Francisco for a long time. Now she's living upstate New York, and she's a reference. And that's what I was talking about, no? This idea of the celebrities and this idea of mixing all this culture and reference, that she has been working for a long time on, on those ideas, no? Wanda Raimundi Ortiz, she was born in New York, but her aesthetic and her work is totally from all these contexts. What happened with the images there?
Off.
Arnaldo Morales, Puerto Rican artist. He creates this kind of very interesting kind of objects. They look like ammunitions. They look like
Welcome.
weapons, yeah. But actually, it's it's totally playful. You can play, this is for shooting colors, actually. But it's all part of this aesthetic, techno aesthetic, but like look really aggressive, but actually is totally playful. You can sit there and play in this very weird object, and he creates the whole thing. He builds everything. Well, this is, I finished
The end.
already. Yeah. If you have any question or something, I will be.
If you have any questions about...
I know it was very fast, but just to bring a view. But my point is that one is in big cities, there are all this mix, and the artists are changing a lot. The way that the way of representing themselves. That's not about Latino per se, or it's all included in their discourse, in their aesthetic. It's very much playing around with all this pop culture, all this techno, pseudo-techno, and for me, they are like a DJs that are missing tracks, that are using a lot of reference together, but it's totally totally different from the artists 10 years ago. They're breaking totally all this discourse, all this way of representation. That's for me the main point. Most of them were born in the United States, and they assume all this culture, this Latino, this culture, and that's what really, for me,
Well, because it's evolving, it's changing, it's actually they're growing in a different way,
Yeah.
and they're mixing with whatever culture they're immersed.
So they don't care about this mainstream discussion. They want to show what they want to show, and they want to deal with the issues about the identity. Yes, you can see, you can notice, and they bring reference together from Latin American here and the context here, but it's totally playful, it's totally like they don't care about this mainstream discourse, way of representation, very serious from post-conceptual artists or post-feminism, doesn't care about that. It's totally open to that and bringing together, yes.
Question, are the curators and the top galleries embracing it completely? Embracing the Latino artists completely? Are they experiencing any resistance?
a
I
good
think
question.
that's a good question. Actually, I think it's very different, and that's, of course, artists have had to fight before their place. And that's what I believe they have to get into this way of representation to discuss those issues. But now more and more artists are accepted in all these contexts, so they don't have the same fight from the 80s, of course, or late 90s. They already have many doors open, and that's thanks to the other generation, of course. So that's why they are more free to express themselves and to bring together all these reference. That's a good question, and that's why, of course.
I wanted
Yeah.
to mention that I was glad to see that several of the artists that you presented, we have had them at the museum. Actually, in one exhibit we had 2 years ago, it was called New York, not New York, but New York with the ñ, with a tilde, the N with a tilde. And I'm really happy that we coincided with some of those artists.
I'm sorry, I showed
And it
this-
was tremendously successful. We have tremendous coverage from the press and a lot of attention. So
And I really think that the galleries and curators are
Yeah.
really embracing and open
Totally.
to the all these new artists and Latino artists as well. And you see it all over United States when you go to the biggest collections or to the galleries as well. Mhm.
Yeah.
I'm not that familiar with performance art just in general. How does that sustain itself economically?
Well, a lot of grants, fellowships from foundations, commissions, and artists work very hard. They have second jobs, of course. They teach. Raimunda, for instance, she received letters like, please, you have to get education, no? Why are you using all this language? She have this character, chuleta. You know? And she said, hey, I teach in a university in Orlando. I'm a teacher, you know? But I embracing all this culture because, you know, I don't care. That's what I grew up in this culture.
chuleta means pork chop.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
exactly the meaning.
Yeah. So they're creating like a new characters and bringing all this subculture into the performance. But yes, they work very hard. Eli Alba, for instance, worked from Monday to Thursday in a regular job, and she works at night, and she has a child and work in her work. She's doing this after 6 o'clock and on the weekends. Yeah, that's a big difference here, no?
And I think
Yeah.
they're really, actually, to point out, they're really hard workers.
Yes,
There's
they
like-
are.
It's basically a little something very common to think that the artists, that they're working really hard.
Yeah.
It's a good question because
Yeah.
they're working really hard. Probably they have several jobs as an artist in order to do the performances and to express what they have to express.
Irving, for instance, in this moment, he's fighting cancer, and he is still working his performance, and he has another job. So I think it's very, very strong position, and that's what really caught my attention because there's a lot of performer artists, a lot. Yes, please. Yes.
Of course.
I'm sorry, Marisa told me, you have 10 minutes, 15 minutes. I'm sorry, I was too fast, no? But most of them have a university background, master degrees, etc., yes. They are very well educated.
At the museum, sorry to interrupt your question. We're very rigorous at our museum with young upcoming artists. We're really picky about training, about formal training, because it's hard work, it's expensive, and it has to be compensated with having the opportunity to exhibit at a museum. So yeah, formal training, as more advanced as it is, it's an important factor in evaluating
Yes.
the presence of artists and in our museum, for example, and I'm sure you do the same.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, I told Marisa, in LA, you have institutions representing Latin American artists, which is really something that you have here, and it's great. But in New York, you have Museo del Barrio, that recently, for the last year, they are open to Latin American artists in general, because as I said before, they were focused only in Caribbean, and not only Caribbean, only the Spanish Caribbeans. But now they're including artists from really a broader, from other islands that they were including before. And then you have the Harlem Museum, which is, from Harlem, but they are open to artists from Latinos artists or from Latin America who, in some point, we are mixed. We are very mixed. We are very mestizo culture. So they're integrating. That's what I say. Using Latino, is very tricky, but that's the way also the artists have this mobility in between institutions. And what else? Brooklyn Museum sometimes have a project now with Tania Bruguera, which is a Cuban artist about immigration, which is very controversial because artists living in New York say, hey, we are here working as, we are immigrants also. We came from parents, immigrants' parents. But I mean, it's really difficult. There is also a museum that has programs that trying to bring, to show artists and discuss, have discussion with artists, and they have like artists in the marketplace, for instance, at the, yes.
There's a question there.
Yeah.
The museum, have you changed your mission statement?
We have, yes.
Okay, because one of the fights we're having here is in fact with MULA and its refusal to change its mission statement. And so when you're talking about the integration of Latino artists into the mainstream and by the fusion of their background and into current art practices, one of the resistances, I think that's something that's happening on the East Coast and is not happening, it's going to happen later maybe on the West Coast. And part of the reason is because there's been a dichotomy in the last 40 years between what is considered Latino Chicano art on the West Coast versus what's considered everybody else's art. And so there's a mindset about what Chicano and Latino art looks like. And I agree with you that it's much more integrated. And if you look at, especially some of the younger artists, they're doing much more, very different work, and it's being, it's very different than what people have previously conceived of as Chicano Latino art on the West Coast. But one of our fights here right now is in fact with MULA, because it has not learned yet that its survival is actually pegged to the Latino community here.
Yes.
He's totally right.
Yeah.
He's
It's
totally
our
right.
case too.
Yeah.
And from our point of view, we view Chicano art as part of Latino. Latino is all-encompassing. We differentiate Latino from Chicano. Latino covers
Everything.
us here, sitting at this table, and we're not related to Mexico at all. And to me, Chicano art is a subdivision of Latino, but I don't know how that would sound here in the West Coast.
Yes, it's a very sensitive topic. I think it is here, because basically there is this separation, which in a way is some people, they're really accepting the separation, and some others, they're not agree. They're all inside the Latino. And I think personally, being part of Building Bridges, the program Building Bridges as a foundation is very interesting, because we're bringing Latino artists here to Los Angeles, and artists from different countries. And some people, they're asking, Okay, but there's Latino, there's Chicano artists. There's but they're coming from where? They're Chicano, no, they're Latinos, which is it's a big confusion for a lot of people. About that topic. Yes, you can probably.
One of the confusions is that people from Latin America are coming and are being accepted into the West Side galleries, for example, here in Los Angeles, and we're still waiting to see when the Chicanos are going to be accepted by the West Side galleries.
That's, yeah.
All of our communities art walks, and you find amazing art that comes from the barrio. And I think that when I see this, and you're saying that most of your artists are educated, they went to universities, and yet here, I think we're promoting, from my perspective, we're promoting a lot of the barrio, the Chicanos, the Asian community, and it's all just as LA. I was born in Hidalgo, outside of Mexico City, and I've been here since I was 7 years old, and I've seen the transition of the city from my being an immigrant, and I've seen the evolution of art too, and the expression, and it's amazing that there's still a confusion between Chicano and Latino from many people. And I think if you were born or raised in downtown in Santa Monica and different parts of LA, you kind of get of the notion of what it really each
Is, yeah.
is. And so that was kind of why I asked that question, because I think that there's a lot of art from people who never went to art schools that have that inherent talent to put into paper or to build art based on their feelings and the transitions that they've seen in their city, in their culture, and in every way.
Yeah, that's what I made before distinctions, because I think, for instance, a lot of artists that I has been presenting briefly here, they came for really working class background. Elia Alba, for instance, I mean, her parents, from Dominican Republic, they were really workers. And her mother was a housewife, basically. So they get educated because they wanted to get educated, you know? But I think what is important, I find in New York, is this sense of community. This project that she's doing, the Supper Clock, you can tell, no, it's about a community. No, she's making the book, she's making all this portrait of artists, but the artists are from, from different, the only thing in common is that they're color artists, because also it's very interesting for me that in New York also the black community, I prefer to use black community, for me doesn't have this, other people say color, which is for me is strange. The black community is mixing with Latino, and they are working together because they have similar fights. No, they have, artists are working on the same thing about race and, and all these issues, very difficult issues, no, and how they, the mainstream has been perceiving them. So Harlem Museum accepting artists from Latin America or Latinos also, the Harlem Museum. So that's another thing of community. But maybe, for instance, in Miami or other cities, I think the idea of suburbia is so strong. Like people are more isolated. They are like separated. I mean, big cities bring together, and institutions also. It's a work of the institutions mostly, and programs inside the institutions. That's very important. I found that's very, very important. Yeah.
Hello. Any other questions?
Yeah.
Yes.
On the bigger picture, you're expressing that there's commingling of community, then they're identifying with international. And you're saying that it's a movement.
No, I don't say it's a movement. I say it's a break in between artists from the until 90s, 80s, 70s. Well, I don't want to talk about Ana Mendieta, et cetera, so I bring more
So, yeah,
close. 90s, yes.
Right, well,
And now, and
what I'm-
today.
Yeah, what I'm trying to see is where these artists are moving to. It seems to me that they're trying to move into a field where art is universal and not losing their identity. That is it, are they intending on being universal as far as an artist is concerned, but not losing their
Yeah,
roots?
I agree totally with you. Yes, of course. I mean, because in Europe is the same, but I found here strongest, because the reality is really tough. It's very tough. I told artists in Europe they are very spoiled, in comparison with United States. The reality here is very tough, and that's why artists are more. They really, you can see this intense view and this idea of this fighting, the performance, and yeah. And the break that I'm talking about is they already are beyond this way of representation and art and artistic practice. It's more performatic. It's more like a carnival. For me, carnival is a day, at least in Cuba, is a day where the slaves were free in some way. I think this doesn't have to do with the talk about, but it's a way where social class and everything breaks, and everybody get together. For me, there's kind of celebration and very strong mixing everything. Like a DJ, for me, artists are like a DJs. You using whatever you want. But before, I found they were into the mainstream discourse, and in between, in those constraints, the frame and the way presenting their work. That's, for me, is a break in there. There were artists working, Pepón Osorio, for instance, yes. There are other artists. But when you talk about Felix González Torre, sugar into minimal art, So that's what I'm talking about. And they are more performatic now. It's like integrating all this technology, all these characters, very popular of mass media. It's like a big reality show, actually, for me, And they don't care. I mean, they say, I don't care. Yeah, and that's for me, is really a break.
Thank you.
That's
Thank
what
you very much.
I was talking. I don't know if.
She has a question
Yeah.
up there in the corner.
Hi, and thank you. This is really, really informative, and I enjoyed the conversation. I have a question back to her question, and regarding the funding in museums, because I really think that social justice issues and community has to become more part of museums, and looking more into the community for where and what art is, not just keeping it as to what is educated. And I'm an educator, so I have a big appreciation for it. But I also think to engage the community and to get funding, there has to be more openness as to what and who is put in a museum and what museums are about. Maybe I'm preaching to the choir, I don't know.
Yeah, no, what you totally got it. Like the only way that we have reached funding is through art projects that are socially engaged. Like we got money to develop this. Like we have no money to like for conservation of extremely valuable pieces. We can't raise funds for that easily, but we do raise funds for example, for a photography project. We hired really good photographers to work with the Salvadoran community in Washington, D.C. and develop an exchange program with at-risk youth in rural El Salvador. And we got money for State Department to develop this project and had a final exhibit about this. And we also got money for a youth orchestra program, because we have other programs beyond like plastic arts. And that's what's bringing money today to museums, and it's bringing life and new energy and new freshness to the museum. But still, there is a serious imbalance anyway, because when you manage this tremendous legacy of a permanent collection, and also we have the obligation to also present like relatively well-established artists from Latin America and Washington, D.C. That is another story and much more difficult to fund. So it's very interesting that the money is in the socially sensitive and in the more formal type of art, where there is like some sort of a elite involved. It's being more difficult to fund. So
I believe all these artists that were presenting here, that their work are very expensive now. So if as a collection, if you want to grow up the collection, I mean, you have to really, it's a lot of money
Yes.
for that.
It is.
So up to date, the collection with all these artists is
it's
quite
very
difficult.
difficult.
Yeah.
It's also, if I talk about, I would like to know what you think about the fact that it's more helpful to that community to see or be reminded about the artists that they can identify with in a gallery. They might see an individual artist in a regular gallery, but seeing all those gathered together, they identify with them more and might be more encouraged to make art themselves or identify with them.
Yes, we do try to build connections with the Latino community and our permanent collection, and making a link to their roots, to this more like classically trained artists, like from another period of time. But on the other hand, we don't get, we do educate, and that's our mission. But in terms of funding, it's then very, very challenging. We're hoping that with a generational change, there will be some, because these generational changes usually come with better education, more money, and so forth, and maybe hopefully getting something back from them in terms of funding. But it's a long-term process.
It's a long process, as we all know. Any other questions for any of them? I just want to I probably repeat again, because I'm not sure if I mentioned earlier, but I don't think so. So I want to tell you that Dermis, she's from Cuba. She lives in Berlin now, so she came all the way to, she was in New York, and we actually bring her here, so it's an honor, really. And she works inside a very large movement with the Latino community, also with artists from the Middle East, and very connected in Berlin as well. And she studied actually art history in La Habana, Cuba. And she has the master's degree in curatorial studies in the Center of Curatorial Studies, Arts in New York. So just to give you a little brief, and of course I already talked about,
Yes, thank you.
Andres.
And you have to give credits to Building Bridges, no?
Yes, it was Building Bridges.
you very much.
It's really, I just want to be very brief, but Building Bridges is a nonprofit that started 8 years ago, probably with a little transformation and growing. And basically the main mission is to build these bridges and build this connection between artists, museums, cultural centers, doing this traveling exhibitions, residencies for artists, as much as we can. Again, as he mentioned early, it's really hard to get funding all the time. We're a nonprofit. We're all the time working really hard. We actually, it's an honor for us to have some of our artists and the artists that they've been working with us here in the fair in different projects. Andrea Juan, who is actually presented here, she's here with us from Argentina. She came all the way to bring us a video art piece that is in the entrance of the fair. So we're trying to bring this guest that they could be important for Los Angeles to see, to watch, to get connected. There's never one way. When you bring a guest, a curator, a director, an artist here, you always have the people, the community from Los Angeles connected with that person, with that artist, and you never know which doors and which bridges you can really make. Because we have these people coming together today. We have Dermis from Berlin, Andres from Washington, Andrea from Argentina, and they're connected here. They meet with people from here. There's always different doors open to different parts of the world, and I think that is the main vision, the main mission of building bridges, and to create understanding between cultures, to create values between artists, between curators, between the community and the art lovers in general, the people who respect artists and respect the hard work that is behind anything that we put together. We actually, I curate a small piece, a small installation from the museum, from AMA here at the fair, which is in booth 1013, if you want to see it. And
it's a really
it's a
powerful, shocking piece. You have to
powerful
see it,
piece.
yes.
Yes, from a Dominican Republican artist, Tony Capellan, and if you can, just stop by booth 1013 to see it. It's a very powerful. And so all these ideas to bring pieces, to all these messages that piece will generate here, all these connections, that is our main mission, and to try to open doors everywhere and with every single opportunity that we have. So it's an honor for me to have both of them here, and Andrea as well. And thank you so much for staying all this long with us.
Thank you.
Thank you for staying here. Thank you, Marisa.